Hi, everybody. I am here with Dr. Maya Barak, and she's going to talk to us today about what pop culture, I think, icon she wants to discuss today.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, for having me. I'm very excited to be here talking about Housewives.
Yeah.
How does the Real Housewives connect to criminology and connect to what I do? So in general, my research looks at things like gang involvement, capital punishment, the legal profession, and immigration. And so if we had more time, we could go through multiple franchises and we could really hit on all of these areas. But there's one thing that I spend a lot of time talking about, which is crimmigration. So the nexus, the intersection of the immigration system and the criminal justice system. And so what I wanted to talk about today is looking at this crimmigration nexus in Real Housewives of New Jersey.
That's fantastic. So as a New Jersey native, I appreciate this. And it's not something that people would kind of really think about, but then this story about Teresa and Joe was kind of like thrust into the public. So I think this will be really interesting to think about how this applies to larger issues of immigration and crime too. So you want to start out with maybe the first video and then we can kind of get your commentary on it?
Yeah, and maybe just a little tiny bit of backstory on the show that could be relevant. So one of the other reasons that I picked Real Housewives of New Jersey, it's one of the older franchises, so it's been on for a long time, and it connects to some of these bigger narratives about immigrants and crime, and specifically Italians and Italian-American immigrants and crime, because from season one, we have these connections to the mafia and sort of rumors that are in the background with some of the families connected to the mafia. But what ends up really coming to the forefront in the show more recently is the actual criminal indictments for fraud of Teresa and Joe.
Yeah. Fantastic. I love this. I'm so excited about it. So if you want to pull up this first video.
Your plea deal was that you would accept prison time. So was it surprising that you wound up getting time?
I didn't understand my plea deal.
You didn't understand what you were agreeing to when you pled guilty?
Completely.
Wow. Joe, there's speculation about whether you may be deported. Do you think that's going to happen?
We'll deal with that issue when it gets.
So I think one of the reasons that I wanted to bring this in, and this connects to crimmigration, it connects to some other things, is that the average person, when you ask the average person, okay, you're facing a criminal conviction, right? You're talking to your lawyer, your public defender, your private attorney, you're talking to them, and they're supposed to advise you of all the consequences of taking a plea deal. Let's say you have, these are the offers we have on the table. These are your chances if you take this to trial. And we know that the vast majority of criminal cases are resolved through plea bargaining, right? Most criminal defense attorneys aren't knowledgeable on immigration law, right? Because they're criminal defense attorneys. They know criminal law. They don't know immigration law. And to be fair, we don't expect attorneys who specialize in certain areas of the law to know all law, and that would just be impossible. The problem here is that there are some really specific and detrimental immigration consequences attached to criminal convictions, and it varies depending on the criminal conviction. And an immigration judge is not going to care that you took a plea bargain and that's how you wound up with this conviction. They just get that document there that says, oh, criminal conviction, right? And so what we see a lot of the time in the real world is attorneys not advising their clients of the immigration consequences of a plea deal, even if they are advising them of all the criminal consequences. And so what may seem like a really great deal initially, right, can come with these surprise collateral damages when it comes to the immigration system. And so when we look at, Teresa and Joe were facing 39 counts of fraud, various types of fraud. And then Joe had a few other charges that kind of piled on. So they were facing a lot of potential prison time. And any rational criminal defense attorney would have said, you need to take a deal, right? There was a lot of evidence against them, both of them. And they were also in a bind because of their children. Right. And so they were able, as part of their plea deal, to negotiate that they would not serve their sentences consecutively so that one of them could stay with the children. However, you know, what becomes apparent as time goes on is that they didn't really understand. Not only does it seem like they didn't understand the plea deal that they took in general and what they were agreeing to, that they were both going to be serving this time. And then it would involve, you know, a house arrest. Teresa finishes her sentence on house arrest, and Joe ends up with 41 months in prison. They didn't understand that that would trigger deportation proceedings.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot. And I think that that's something that's taken for granted, I think, for people who are naturalized citizens or who are citizens in general, that it's not this like multi-stage process that will ultimately involve you not being able to stay with your family.
Yeah. And in particular, you know, there were a lot of reforms, a lot of immigration reforms over the last 30 years that have really connected the criminal justice system and the immigration system. The immigration system is a civil system, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, deportation is not punishment. It's just a consequence. You're here and you're removable, so we order you to be removed from the country. It's not seen as a punishment. Time spent in immigration detention is not seen as a punishment, the way that we think about a jail sentence or a prison sentence. However, really since 1996, we've seen this fusion of criminal punishments for immigration offenses and then immigration consequences for criminal offenses. And so in particular, some of these reforms involved highlighting crimes of moral turpitude and aggravated felonies. And so what that means is even some crimes that probably you and I would think of as not so serious, could be things that are misdemeanors, could be victimless crimes, nonviolent crimes. Mm-hmm. These are considered this sort of in these special categories that make somebody deportable, even if they're here with a green card. Right. And so Joe came to the US as a baby with his family, legally with visas. He had a green card. He spent his whole life here. He worked, he owned businesses, he engaged in some fraud in connection to those businesses. He owned property, he has his family, but he still was not a citizen. And so because of that, and especially because fraud is considered a crime of moral turpitude, and some of these things are aggravated felonies, you're getting deported 9.999 times out of 10. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot. It really is. Because there's also like this white collar element to it, right? That like a certain level of knowledge that you need for that too. So it's all of these things kind of piling on for him and his family.
Definitely.
And that, I mean, he was relatively well off. And when I say relative, I mean like probably better off than me or you or any other professors. So his experience in detention was not a good one, as we can tell.
Yes. Should we watch that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can watch his call, the second video, we can watch his call. Mm-hmm.
Joe Guidice is set to be released from prison, but he will not be heading home.
Joe Guidice is in ICE custody. Guidice will remain at the immigration center indefinitely while he awaits his deportation ruling.
This is a call from Joe. You may start the conversation now.
Hello?
So this video is a little bit weird in that I feel like I should have put the captions on the front half of it so we knew what was being said.
It's okay. I mean, the key here is really what he's saying now, and they caption that since it's hard to hear him because he's calling from a federal detention center. You know, and later on in the season, they actually do go and they visit the detention center, but of course, the cameras can't go inside. You basically see them arriving at the detention center and trying to visit him. And in fact, in one of the episodes where they do try to visit Joe in detention, they realize that they forgot their IDs. Teresa left her ID at home. They're driving, I think, 4 hours to get to this federal detention center because most, just like most, you know, state and federal facilities, they're oftentimes out in rural areas. They're very, they're not close to cities. They're not close to large immigrant communities most of the time. So when people are placed in immigration detention, it's usually very difficult for their family members to go and visit them. And only certain people are able to enter these facilities, right? People with the proper documents. And so they almost have to turn around. But because this family is a well-off family, Teresa's able to get an assistant to hurry and meet them with their IDs so that they can go inside and see Joe. But so one of the things that's really interesting here too, part of the story, and I think you touched on this a moment ago, Sarah, when you said that this family is privileged. This is a privileged family in a lot of different ways. You know, and again, leading us back to those sort of, on the outside at least, an immigrant success story, right? These are the children of immigrants. Joe himself an immigrant, but came as a baby to the US. They have these businesses, they have these homes, they have lots of money and privilege, and they don't think they've done anything wrong, right? They don't understand necessarily what they've done wrong. And so there's a disconnect, because when Joe is transferred from immigration, or from the federal prison in the criminal system to federal detention in the immigration system, he sees himself as different from the people who are there, different from a lot of the other immigrants who are there. He doesn't deserve to be there. He's not like these people. And the way that he feels he's being treated is that it's harsher than the federal prison where he was, that the conditions are worse. And so, as he says, I'm going to go nuts. Like, I'm on lockdown here. This is crazy. It's harder for the family to talk to him. It's harder for the family to come visit him. There are stricter requirements. He doesn't have as much free time to move around while he's there in the immigration facility. Of course, what's important for us to keep in mind is that many people who are being held in immigration detention have not committed a criminal offense at all. In fact, even people who come to the US following the legal protocol to apply for asylum are often placed in immigration detention. And many of these detention facilities are actually criminal justice facilities that have contracts with ICE, with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. So they're holding people in jail or prison who have been convicted of crimes at the same time and in the same conditions and places where they're holding people who are fleeing for their lives and requesting asylum.
That's wild. That's insanity. Yeah. And also, like, I don't know if they meant to do this in the video, but like the juxtaposition of him calling from a facility and then showing kind of the facade of their home, the inside of which we'll see in the next video. But I think that's insane too, that he went from this very posh northern New Jersey Chris Christie country life to, you know, a federal prison and also a detention facility. It's crazy.
Yes, it is. And I think also the thing to keep in mind too is not only this juxtaposition, but also how this image, the image that we see of, and the story that we follow of Joe going through the immigration process and the deportation process. There's not only a disconnect for Joe and his family and what that means for them, but there's perhaps a disconnect for viewers. Like what we see in the media about who goes to immigration detention, who gets deported, and what these situations and facilities are like. So this is kind of contradicting perhaps the typical discourse that we see around these issues.
Absolutely, yeah, just because they speak English, right? And that the idea of like Italian undocumented immigrants here, right? Like it is kind of outrageous to think about, just because the narrative is usually about Central and South America. Mainly, and that they're rich.
And that they're rich.
Okay, so if we want to listen to another phone call from him talking about his experience, we can do that.
My father's like, you want to come over and eat?
Okay.
I would love to.
Yeah. Did you put in the visiting forms for us? Because the girls want to come and see you.
I don't know how it works over here. This isn't a normal prison, all right? Nobody knows anything in here.
Are you okay?
Am I okay? I mean, what am I doing? I'm okay. I'm going on 38 months in this crap. They want to separate us now. We're married 20 years. We got 4 kids. All right, they want to destroy 4 kids. I'm here now, and I'm getting deported, and that's all there is to it. I mean, it's over.
You don't know if that's going to happen.
I don't know, but I don't see
So one of the things here, obviously, that we're seeing Joe and Teresa talking about the impact on their family, the impact this has had on their family, that it's hard for the family to be separated. It's hard to know that Joe is in detention and fighting this deportation case. And, you know, at some point, he does receive that final order of removal, final order of deportation. And they do try to appeal that, right? And they're waiting. This whole time they're waiting, and he is still in detention awaiting these appeals. And there's a tension among his children. They have the 4 girls. And, you know, the children want him to stay and fight, essentially. And he's starting to get pretty exhausted by being months and months, 41 months in federal prison, and then going right into his immigration detention. And how long is this going to take? And they're, you know, they go back and forth here. They go back and forth in different parts of this season about what he should do and if he should give up. Should he give up and go back to Italy, or should he be here? But what I think is so interesting actually about this clip and why I chose it is also because Teresa's father is there. And he is so mad at Joe for so many reasons. You can imagine if your son-in-law, you know, winds up bringing your child, whether, you know, they're an adult or not, but bringing Teresa into this situation where she may or may not have known fully what she was doing when she was signing these documents that were part of the fraud case. So she gets sent to prison. He gets sent to prison. Now he's being deported. It's breaking up the family. And what the father says at one point, when Teresa's father says is, he never did it right. I told him over and over to get his citizenship. I told him to become a citizen, and he didn't do it. This is implying this is his fault. He had the privilege. He had the opportunity to become a citizen. And had he become a citizen, he couldn't have been deported for these offenses. Right?
So, yeah, I think that's like an added layer here of like his own culpability. Like, not only did he break the law, but he brought this situation on himself, which is kind of unfortunate in some sense. But, you know, you talk about his family and his children and the effects on that. So we can watch the second video where it talks about the effect on kids and maybe about how that affects everyone else.
Graduation, I'm going to college. Those are 3 big things I want my father here for. No one cares.
No, she needs
to. Okay, I don't know why you have to act irrational, because if you were graduating, moving on to a new chapter of your life. Okay. Melania, I don't want to hear you. I understand we're all hurting, but I'm saying it's a big year for me and I would want my father here. I'm done here. Goodbye. Okay, this is what you do.
Yeah, you could leave, honey.
Love you. I didn't say anything wrong.
Yeah, Melania's just very sensitive.
It's like, you're gonna have dad here. And like, you should be like really grateful for that.
We don't know that yet. I mean, God willing, we
Okay,
will.
but it's like, at least you won't be locked up anymore. You're lucky.
Yeah. And so here we see the 4 daughters, and we see Teresa and her father. And again, the family has a lot of conversations about this, as any family would, trying to figure out what are our options, what can we do, and how is this affecting us? And we know from the research that children whose parents are swept up in raids, or whose parents end up in, well, we also know from the research there are impacts on children whose parents go to prison, right? There are a lot of impacts there. But especially when it comes to immigration, there's a lot of research that shows that children become very depressed, right? Children of all ages. I say children, anyone who's young, anyone who's in high school, even in college, becomes very depressed and shaken by losing a parent to deportation, right? Losing a parent to deportation. And the other thing to keep in mind too, when they're having these conversations about the things that he's going to miss out, there are, again, these parallels to when we see a parent who's incarcerated, right, for long periods of time. The things that you miss out that you can never make up, right? You can't come back for that graduation. It's not going to be possible. But in this case, a deportation, in Joe's case, is more like being sentenced to life in prison without parole. Because given what happened, there are bars depending on the circumstances of a deportation, there are 5, 10, 15 and permanent bars, 5, 10, 15 year bars and permanent bars to ever coming back to the US. And that's not just having the option, it's having the option to apply for a visa to come back, which could still be denied. And so in this case, you know, yes, Joe is being deported back to Italy. I think a lot of us would go, oh, Italy, I would love to vacation in Italy. That sounds lovely. Compared with the circumstances that a lot of people who wind up deported are returning to, because most people who are in deportation proceedings and who do, for the most part, wind up being removed, deported, over the last, 5-10 years have been Central Americans. A lot of these people are Central Americans. And a lot of these people were fleeing situations that were not good. A lot of them dealing with gang violence, dealing with government corruption. Historically, going back to the 80s, these same countries' civil wars, earthquakes, we think about all of these things. So when people are being deported back to those circumstances, sometimes it's a death sentence. It really is more like a death sentence. If someone is trying to receive asylum in the US and they aren't granted asylum, and basically their claim is, I'm being persecuted in my home country and I face violence and death, right, if I'm returned, and they get deported, there are cases, and a lot of journalists have followed this, especially in relation to Central Americans. You go back and you are killed, right, once you're deported. So Joe is going to Italy. They can visit him, but he's still going to miss out on all these family milestones, and he won't, even though it's just Europe, he can't just hop on a flight and come back for a graduation.
Right. And all these things that are really important, I think, like developmentally for a teenage girl. So to have her father absent from them, it can be really, I think, upsetting for them in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and because these girls already have been without their father now for 4 years. And before that, they were without their mother for 1 year. They had that year. So their family has been disrupted at this point. The youngest, Gabriella, I think is the youngest. Trying to remember how old she is at this point, but this started in 2013, right? And we're watching episodes from, this is like 2019 when this is going on. So 6 years of your life, if you're 10 or 11 years old, that's a lot, right? Do you even really remember your family being together? And so much growing up is happening for these girls, and their dad's not there.
And then to boot, it's all being documented for reality television, right? And it's being splashed all over the headlines.
Yes.
It's sad for them. It really is. Okay, and then in the next video, Teresa reacts to the deportation and kind of the appeal and the rejection of that, really.
What? I was like, I couldn't believe it. In my gut, I'm like, he's got to come home. We have 4 daughters. My daughters adore him. He's their life. Like, literally, I'm their mom. I've been doing everything for them, but all they care about is their father. It's like crazy. Like, especially my 3rd child, she's having, a hard time with this whole thing, and it's affecting her. And I just keep counting the days for him to come home because she really needs him.
Yeah. And so again, I think there was this just came as a huge surprise to this family, as it would to many families. And I think as it probably did to a lot of viewers, that someone who is here legally in the US could end up deported, and that there's really nothing that can be done about it. And for a family, yes, this family was involved in, Joe, at least Joe, if not also Teresa, were involved in fraud. A lot of people wouldn't think of that as being perhaps serious enough to merit deportation from the country.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to me that she was talking about the relationship with her kids and how they really want him because she's a single mom, and that she is permanently a single mother now to do all these things. So if she weren't a resourced individual,
yes,
the really, like, the financial impact of that and how it could affect her family could be devastating.
Well, and that's such an important point to bring up, Sarah. Again, and I know we've talked about this, their resources, right? And the privilege that this family does have. In immigration court, there is no right to indigent defense. So in criminal court, if you can't afford an attorney, the state provides one, right? And one appointed or public defender system. In immigration court, you have the right, I put it in quotes because, we have to ask ourselves, how meaningful is this right? Do we really have a right if we can't afford it? So you have the right to be represented by counsel, but only if you can pay that counsel yourself. And so in this case, this family is very privileged. They have a lot of resources. They're able to not only, I'm sure they had a legal team that included multiple attorneys. And they had presumably a good defense, right? Presented a strong case in immigration court, but it doesn't really matter because even with the resources and even when you're represented, for a lot of people, there is no relief from deportation, particularly those with criminal convictions. Right. So it doesn't matter what kind of argument you make. It doesn't matter that you have a U.S. citizen wife, that you have U.S. citizen children. In very rare cases, there are hardship sort of exemptions where if one of your U.S. citizen family members will be in extreme hardship if you're deported, there are ways for you to be able to stay and sort of a cancellation of removal of that deportation. But the bar is so high and the options for fighting deportation are so few that even if you have money to hire a good attorney, it usually isn't going to make that much of a difference.
And even in this case, then their privilege kind of formed an argument against them, right? That they'll be fine without him.
Right. Yeah. That they'll be okay without him. Mm-hmm. They're not going to face a hardship. And in fact, many could argue that Teresa, at least for the last several years, has been bringing in much more money than Joe, given her status as a reality, celebrity, with her cookbooks, multiple cookbooks. She wrote a book about her experiences in prison, right? And so, yes, arguably, Joe was not the breadwinner in the family, and this family wouldn't face extreme hardships. Wow. And when I say extreme hardships, it has to be something really severe, like my U.S. citizen child has very specific medical needs that can only be taken care of in the United States and are costly and require XYZ. And if I'm not here, then they might die, right? It's like a very high bar.
So not like I might not be able to pay my bills.
No. No. Or like in their case, no, my kids might not be able to get like the brand new iPhone or something. It's not, or, get their glam done. Like them not affording glam is not a hardship. So.
So I think we just touched on this a little bit about legal consciousness, but I think we should watch this last video just to really speak to this about the understanding that people have about these processes.
What did you do?
I signed papers without reading them, and before I ever do that again, I'm going to make sure whenever I put my John Hancock on, that I understand fully before signing any other papers in the future.
Yeah. So, and I know we sort of talked about this already, but it's so interesting. Teresa says this over and over again. So she makes similar statements about not understanding what she was signing in terms of the fraud, what she was doing in terms of her plea deal, what the immigration consequences were going to be for her family, for Joe, as a result of all of this. She talks about this on Watch What Happens Live with Andy. She talks about this in ET interviews. She talks about this on the show. And over and over again, you hear that she really didn't understand the law. She didn't understand the way that the law works. And so one of the connections, again, for me as someone who studies legal consciousness, which is, the short version of that is it's just how we think about and relate to the law, what we know about the law, where our legal knowledge comes from. Most of us are not attorneys, right? Most of us haven't sat down and read even, most of us probably don't know the traffic laws in our own town, right? We're just like driving around. Okay, I hope I get this right. And the thing is, you can't, if a police officer pulls you over for speeding, and they go, oh, well, do you know what you were doing? You say, I didn't see a speed limit sign, so I didn't realize I was speeding. I didn't know the law here. Well, that's not going to get you out of it, right? Unless it's somehow you have a good day with the cop and you get a warning. And that's a whole nother episode, perhaps, of this. But it's so interesting to see an example of a family which in so many ways is not average, but at the same time is sort of like an average American family, not understanding the law and not understanding how it's going to affect them, right? Their knowledge of the law, coming from probably for most of us, it's about the stories we hear from our friends, from our family, our one-off experiences, and the things that we see about the law on TV. And so that's like the meta layer of this is what us as viewers start to learn about the law and how this changes the way we think about and relate to the law by following the story of Teresa and Joe.
Do you think that people are sympathetic to her story? And this,
that's a good question. I think it's, so there, I followed the story closely. I followed some of the reporting on the story. And it was really mixed. I think the way that what happened to their family was framed, it was a sympathetic a lot of the time, especially for Teresa, because at least she claims that she didn't know what was going on. She didn't know what she was signing when it came to the fraudulent mortgages and issues with a fake bankruptcy and taxes and different things that they were doing. And Joe has said he would just ask her to sign documents and she would sign them. Maybe she knew, maybe she didn't know. Giving her a bit of the benefit of the doubt, there is research, criminological research, about how women can be put in these situations where they're taken advantage of to a certain extent by their partners, right? Where they're sort of drawn into committing criminal acts they may or may not know. We see that when it comes to gangs, right? Mm-hmm. Asking girlfriends to hold drugs, hold guns, right? Give me a ride here or there. Mm-hmm. Let me stay at your house, right? So it is quite possible that she really didn't know. But at the same time, I think because this family had a lot of money, because they had a lot of privilege, because they're celebrities, they've argued that actually the only reason this case was investigated was because they're on TV. And one of the claims that Teresa has made on a few occasions is that Caroline Manzo, who was originally the OG on the cast, whose father-in-law was allegedly connected to the mafia, that they had a feud, and she tipped off the FBI to look into them. So were they targeted because they are on the show? Were they treated differently because they're on the show? Are they less sympathetic because they're on the show, perhaps? And some of the language, again, that I've seen in terms of the reporters who are talking, ET reporters who are talking about this case, right, is they should have known better. And they still, Joe kind of got what he deserved. It's sad, but he got what he deserved because he still is a criminal. So.
Yeah, I think balancing that they're celebrities in some sort, right? Versus that kind of almost that eat the rich mentality, mm-hmm. And then also even examining my own feelings about it. Mm-hmm. I'm if this was this difficult for you with all of your resources, imagine what this is like for other families, mm-hmm. normal families. So I find it hard to be sympathetic, but I'm trying. For my fellow New Jerseyan. But I really do appreciate this. I feel like there are other episodes and groups of Real Housewives that we could explore moving forward. So we may have to have you back for a part 2.
Thank you. I'll come back anytime to talk Housewives.
Oh, so. Fantastic. I don't know. Too Hot to Handle might be on the docket too, though.
If it's reality TV, I'm here for it.
Absolutely. So. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks.